Top tip number 9, isolate your subject. If you can isolate your subject, it can often make a far more striking and memorable photograph. Oftentimes I see photos where the subject is wonderful, the lighting is beautiful, but the background is so distracting, or the subject has something growing out of their head. One of the easiest ways to overcome this problem can be to move just a little bit to one side or the other, and you'll notice the relationship between your subject and the background can change quite dramatically. Also, by moving your point of view higher or lower, this can have a similar effect. Or if you can move your subject, for example, if you're shooting a portrait, shift the person to an area or location where the background is not so cluttered and distracting. My favourite technique for eliminating a distracting background is shooting with a lens that can open up to f1.4 or f2.8. Using these very wide apertures, it's easy to get your subject sharp and your background well out of focus. Depending on what lens you're using and how wide the aperture will open, will affect how much the background is out of focus. If you're using a fairly wide angle lens, you'll need a very wide aperture. I have a 35mm f1.4 lens, and this is beautiful for creating isolated subjects. If you're using a longer lens, your background can be more out of focus, even using, say, f4 or f5, depending on the distance between your subject and the background and your subject and your camera. You'll need to really experiment with this to get a feel for how far your subject needs to be from the background, depending on what lens and what aperture setting you're using. You can also isolate your subject by careful use of lighting. If you can place your subject in a location where there is more light falling on your subject than there is on the background, you can take your exposure meter reading from the subject and the background will appear a lot darker in the photograph, so long as the light ratio is different enough. Also, if you have a situation where your subject is a much lighter tone than your background, even if the lighting conditions are the same, there may still be sufficient difference between the light reflected off your subject than is reflected off the background to really isolate your subject nicely. I shoot this style of portrait against a black background where both the background and the subject are in similar lighting conditions. The sun is behind the background and the subject is standing just out of the shade area, so the light is reflecting off the bare earth in front of them to give a nice warm fill light. This is just using available light. I use no flash or other artificial light in these photographs. I rely on metering carefully off the subject's faces and knowing that that is a lot brighter than the background, my subjects are isolated. Having the light behind the subject also adds a nice backlight to separate them from the background somewhat. By isolating your subject from the background, you can make more dramatic and memorable photographs. As you begin to see situations where you can isolate your subject from the background, you will be more creative with your camera.